Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to yet another panel on Arctic security. I'm Dr. Christopher Young. I'm the Dean of the Marine Corps War College, and it's my distinct pleasure to be the moderator. So on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Norwegian Defense University College, Marine Corps University Foundation, welcome to this week's Arctic Security Symposium. An inaugural series exploring the policy, strategies, and tactics underpinning security in the High North, an extremely important and timely topic. Before we begin, I have to have my standard governmental phrase, which all federal employees know by heart, but unfortunately, even though I have been a federal employee for years, I don't have memorized. All opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of Marine Corps University, Norwegian Defense University College, the specific individual associations of our panelists, or any other agency of the U.S. or Norwegian government. All right. Also, take note, we'll be recording this panel for the benefit of those in the community of interest who could not join us today, so we ask that you be mindful of keeping your microphones muted to avoid disrupting the presentation, as well as please turn off your own webcams to help stream smoothly. At the conclusion of our guest presentation, we'll have a question and answer session. So if you have a question, please type in the group chat, and we'll ask the question to the panel on your behalf. And please note that we will only accept questions via WebEx chat, and that the Facebook live stream will not be active for the question and answer period. So I'm happy to introduce our today's guest panelists. So first we have Liselotte Odgaard, who's a senior fellow with the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies and a non-residential senior fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington. Her work focuses on U.S.-China-Europe relations, including NATO-China relations, Chinese foreign security and defense policy, Indo-Pacific security, and the geopolitics of the Arctic region. Dr. Odgaard has been a visiting scholar at institutions such as Harvard, the Woodrow Wilson Institution, International Center for Scholars, and the Norwegian Nobel Institute. She's the author of numerous monographs, books, peer-reviewed articles, and research papers on Chinese and Asia-Pacific security. And she's a frequent commentator on these issues in the media. Next, we have Tormod Heier, who I have had the pleasure of presenting papers and working with in Brussels, but he is a lieutenant colonel and a professor, but a lieutenant colonel in the Norwegian Army and professor at the Command and Staff College in Oslo. He served in Afghanistan, the Ministry of Defense, and Norway's intelligence service. His field of interest is NATO, Russia, and U.S. strategies. And of course, he has authored and co-authored several books on the employment of force as part of Norwegian security and foreign policy. So it's my distinct pleasure to have these two highly esteemed scholars talk about Arctic security. And so let's start off with Liselotte, who will be giving a presentation on China's maritime interests and general approach to the Arctic. So with that, Liselotte, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I wish I could be there in person, but I hope to get the chance another time. The research I'm presenting on China's role in the Arctic comes out of an article that was just published together with two Americans, Taylor Fravel and Catherine Lavelle. And basically, our argument is that China is coupling its Arctic strategy to its Belt and Road Initiative for Global Development, which I assume you're all familiar with. This signals that China is in the region, in the Arctic region, for the long haul, and that its focus is on the commercial, scientific, and political benefits to be had from an Arctic presence. The effort involves developing a scientific, communications, and transportation infrastructure that China has access to and which can be used for military strategic purposes at a future date if China considers that useful to advance its interests. However, at this point in time, China's military engagement and interest in the Arctic are minimal in a region that in the big picture remains peripheral to China. So this is also a reminder that inferences from Chinese behavior in one region to other regions must be carried out with great caution. In some regions and towards some actors, China is clearly a major geostrategic and geopolitical challenge, but in the Arctic, such behavior would be counterproductive, we argue, to China's predominantly commercial interests. And it doesn't have much interest in stirring the pot at this point in time. Of course, that may change. On the other hand, its economic presence, such as its interest in rare earths and minerals, has strategic implications that need to be taken into account when engaging with China in the Arctic. China pursues its Arctic interests, we think, through a complex engagement that encompasses bilateral, multilateral, and ad hoc forums. China works within existing regimes and frameworks in the region, and it also participates in developing these, but it also attempts to influence them from without, for example, through bilateral cooperation with key Arctic states, such as Russia. We look at three areas. Specifically, we look at navigation, we look at resource extraction, and we look at scientific engagement. In the area of navigation, China pursues what we call a globalized approach. So China uses global principles around navigational rights to legitimize its presence in the Arctic. And as Arctic sea routes become commercially more viable, especially the Northern Sea Route, they become more important for China's commercial shipping fleet, which is now the world's largest. To the degree that the Chinese military has a prospective role in the Arctic region, it is likely to trail the advancement of commercial interests and the degree to which they would require protection in these waters. China relies heavily on the law of the sea to ensure its ability to navigate throughout the Arctic and the right of Chinese vessels to navigate through the exclusive economic zones and the international straits of Arctic coastal states. This approach emphasizes the preeminence of Chinese economic interests, such as the benefits for its shipping industry and the development of the country's northern seaports. Chinese interpretations of international law and navigation can appear contradictory. For example, Chinese legislation puts restrictions on access to China's territorial sea, but this does not restrict China's willingness to transit through the territorial sea of other states if they do not require prior permission or notification. Indeed, its emphasis on in the Polar Silk Road White Paper on Navigation suggests that Beijing is inclined to view the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route as international waters, which is in line with the U.S. view, rather than that of Canada and Russia. China pursues bilateral cooperation with Russia on navigation-related projects, such as financial support for infrastructure, which supports the further integration of China as an engine of the global economy while assisting Russia in developing the Northern Sea Route. And it tries to, in this way, to facilitate core interests of both China and Russia. With regard to resource extraction, we find that China relies heavily on bilateral cooperation to access Arctic mineral resources, such as oil and gas, while it primarily adopts a multilateral approach to fisheries. Most hydrocarbon resources fall within the territorial jurisdiction of Arctic coastal states, and the remaining high seas are difficult to develop unilaterally. Russia has welcomed Chinese investments as one of several investor countries, and hence China has provided major financial resources in the development of Russian liquefied natural gas facilities. China is also well integrated into Russia's fishing industry, which also is in need of investments. Chinese investments have been less welcome in other Arctic nations. For example, efforts to get involved in the construction of airports in Greenland was rejected, as was offers to buy an old Navy base. China has refrained from engaging in quarrels with geopolitical connotations on these issues, and that indicates to us that China is aware that it's a newcomer which has to legitimize its presence in the Arctic. In the fisheries sector, China has supported the agreement to ban commercial fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean, since it will take years before any commercial fishing is possible, and participation in the agreement will make China a party to future agreements and also provide legitimacy to its scientific pursuits in the Arctic. It both protects Chinese interests and it promotes its image as a benevolent great power that protects common interests in a sustainable environment. In the area of science, China has pursued a regional approach in the sense that it has involved itself across all parts of the regime complex in the Arctic, and with a wide range of Arctic and non-Arctic states to explore opportunities for pursuing its scientific interests. Participation in Arctic science activities is a gateway for China to play a greater role in the Arctic. It gives political and financial contribution. It offers relevant expertise. It supports the Arctic Council and wants a greater role there. And also, science has been China's physical point of entry to the Arctic. China has leading positions in Arctic science fora. It has built observatories and other platforms for scientific research across the Arctic, and China has organized multilateral science expeditions. And for sure, China has legitimate environmental concerns in the Arctic, but it also has dual-use interests in China's scientific engagement, or there are also dual-use interests in its scientific engagement, such as intelligence gathering, situational awareness, and access to strategic infrastructure. So in conclusion, we argue that the complexity of the regional setting that you find in a region such as the Arctic does not allow even a great power such as China to have simple, universally applicable policies and principles. China has to adjust these to the regional circumstances and to its particular preferences and interests in that region as well. However, we also find that institutional complexity, such as that found in the Arctic, is to the advantage of a great power, such as China, because it can rearrange linkages between issue areas, it can shape regime agendas to a greater extent than other powers. So the benevolent low-key image of China's presence is coupled to a narrow focus on pursuing Chinese interests, and that explains China's manipulation, if you like, of the regime complex, and it justifies characterizing its approach to the Arctic as a Janus-based approach with a sort of benevolent face, but there is also some less pretty motives behind its behavior.
Thank you, Liselotte. And now let's turn to Tormod for his presentation.
Thank you very much for that. I will try to answer the question, how can we avoid conflicts in the Arctic in the future? My starting point will be, of course, Russia, which is, in a way, the Arctic great power with long historic traditions in the Arctic. And I think it's very unlikely that Russia, in a way, will be deterred in the Arctic militarily. And that is due to two strategic assets that they possess, which makes Russia very special in the Arctic. First of all, is that they control very much of the Arctic, where at least 80% of its oil revenue and 90% of its gas revenue comes from. In total, 20% of the GDP, as we heard yesterday, comes from the Arctic. And secondly, I also think that Russia's second strike capability, which is situated on the Kola Peninsula, is the most important foreign policy instrument that Russia today has in order to have some kind of symmetry with the United States on the international arena. This is the most important fleet and the most important instrument of nuclear forces, just 40 to 120 kilometers from the Norwegian border. So these assets, I think they are so crucial for Russia that it's very unlikely that Russia will be deterred by expeditionary forces coming into the Arctic. So as a strategic competition in a way exceeds between the United States and China and Russia, what we see in the Arctic is that unexpected maneuvers from Russian rivals, they might even cause more tension and induce some kind of a tit-for-tat logic, which easily stirs a security dilemma in this region. And I was told yesterday that the Norwegian Minister of Affairs has already voiced slightly some concern to the U.S. State Department about the National Defense Strategy from 2018, signaling strategic predictability but operationally unpredictability. So by taking up Brigadier General Henderson's words from yesterday, how can, for instance, Norwegian and U.S. forces operate as one force, in a way displaying a credible deterrence in the high north, but also without inducing more tension in this region? And that starting point, I think, would be to take in Secretary Austin's message to the force, this memorandum that came from Pentagon on 4th of March this year, where he explicitly tied U.S. security to allies, and where he explicitly tied the importance of team working between U.S. and allied forces, where also allies were seen as strategic assets. But however, U.S. friends, allies and partners, they are not only strategic assets for U.S. security, they are sovereign states. And sovereign states, they tend to pursue national interests. And sometimes these national interests coincide in the high north, and sometimes they don't. They coincide, for instance, in the sense that the Norwegian and U.S. naval aviation assets are operating out from Norway to sustain situation awareness and control of where the Northern Fleet is operating. It also coincides in terms of providing signal intelligence to U.S. decision makers every time the Northern Fleet deploy for operations, and in a way serving as an early warning station for U.S. Homeland Security in terms of a crisis that might escalate into some kind of a nuclear deterrent situation. But interest between two close allies in the high north, particularly in the Barents Sea region, also diverge. For instance, Norwegian frigates are not allowed to become integrated into U.S. missile defense with its Aegis radars. Maritime patrol craft from the U.S. Air Force, they are not allowed to operate east of the Bear Gap, too close to the Russian border when they deploy from Norwegian territory, and we also do not have permanent U.S. bases in Norway in peacetime. And so divergence between close allies is very much based on the fact that geography is destiny, which means that Norway and Russia, in a way, has some kind of a security which is inseparable, which means that Norwegian and U.S. forces will never be secure in the Barents Sea region unless Russian forces feel the same. So which is important then in terms of Russia and the high north is to try to balance, restrain, as much as deterrence. And that reminds me of the words from the Honorable Kenneth Braithwaite last afternoon, yesterday, when he was asked by Senator Rubio in the Senate, what can you learn from Norway? And the answer was peaceful coexistence with Russia. And the Norwegian and Russian interests, they coincide very much in terms of oil and gas and fishery management and environmental issues, search and rescue for the Barents Sea fishing fleets. And what I think the Norwegian government is slightly concerned about in terms of Norwegian-American cooperation in this area is that a too heavy-handed military component may have a serious spillover effect into the softer and more into the softer policy areas, because Norwegian governments in the High North, they do not regard Russia as a strategic competitor or a threat. So how can then we avoid conflict in the High North? How can US and Norwegian forces operate as one force to provide a credible deterrent towards Russia, but at the same time also avoid unnecessary tension that might spiral into something more serious, which makes it difficult to sustain a peaceful coexistence in this very important region? And I think three aspects are worth mentioning. First of all, that we need to engage the combatant commands and the military schools to invoke more knowledge, more skills and practical expertise into the units which is to be designated in the future for Arctic operations, maybe through seminars or tabletop exercises or even wargaming courses of actions. I do also think that we need more vigorously to engage State Department, the country desk, and even the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs or the Minister of Interior, even the Prime Minister's office, as well as MOD officials, and insulate their strategic perspectives further and deeper into the military chain of command. And finally, I think we need also, maybe we should regard revitalizing the bilateral study group, which we established in the mid-1970s between Norway and the United States, in order to generate some kind of updated situation awareness on the local security dynamics in the High North, in order to preclude unnecessary tension. And I'm saying these things because I do not want US forces to end up in some kind of a military quagmire in the High North, because that will severely make US forces less flexible. And in accordance with the dynamic force employment concept, flexibility is crucial for US forces that might operate in two theaters at the same time, both in the South China Sea and in the High North. So avoiding a quagmire or avoiding some kind of a very tense area where US forces are stuck for a long time, they should really be trying to avoid that in order to maintain their global flexibility.
Well, we're at our time. Please join me in thanking Liselotte and Tormod in a very fine presentation on China and Russia and the Arctic. Very informative. Thank you very much.